Okay, so in the short video lecture series, we're at a point of talking about techniques that can be employed to reduce the application of chemical pesticides. And one approach is through integrated pest management. Integrated pest management, also known as IPM, aims to minimize the use of synthetic organic pesticides, and it uses the application of sociological, economic, and ecological factors in crop protection, as well as views crops and pests as part of a dynamic system. So the goal was not pest eradication, but rather keeping crop damage below the economic threshold. The EPA uses a four-tiered approach to IPM, and those four-tiered approaches include setting action thresholds, monitoring and identifying pests, preventing pests, and controlling pests. And I'll go into those in more detail. The diagram that's depicted here is in reference to some IPM programs that were put into place in India. And for 15 years, Indonesian farmers used heavy pesticide applications on high-yielding rice. What ended up happening is brown plant hoppers became resistant to the pesticides and they devastated the rice crops. Scientists from the International Rice Research Institute find that pesticides are actually killing natural predators, which also allows for the brown plant hopper populations to increase. In 1986, Indonesian government bans the use of most pesticides used on rice. The government has saved millions of dollars by not having to buy pesticides. Also, farmers have saved money by not having to buy pesticides or the equipment to spray them. Thousands of tons of pesticides have not entered the environment, and now the fish are thriving in the rice paddies. Consumers and wildlife have increased benefits from not using pesticides in India, and the FAO is setting up similar programs in other countries. So what happened is after they banned the pesticides, the government and the FAO set up farmer field schools where farmers were taught rice ecology and integrated pest management techniques. Farmers now spread out and teach other farmers what they've learned, and the rice harvest in Indonesia has improved and has saved millions of money each year because they don't have to pay for all the pesticides with the farming applications. So it's been a successful program. Essentially what has happened is they've created a balanced ecosystem with the rice paddies, and the natural predators have come back that are feeding on the brown plant hoppers, and there's been success in harvest of rice from this area. There's actually over 200,000 different farms enrolled in this program, which has definitely contributed to its success. I mentioned earlier the four-tiered approach to IPM that the EPA has implemented. The first thing they do is they set action thresholds to identify the point where conditions indicate that some control is needed. They monitor and identify the pests for a particular crop, and experts determine if the pests exceed the economic threshold. The organizations that do this are farm cooperatives or field scouts and extension services. For example, the Penn State Extension Service would do this in Pennsylvania for farmers and help farmers. They prevent pests through cultural and biological controls, as well as crop rotation, utilizing natural predators, and fertilizing and doing trap crops to reduce pests for the crops that they're trying to harvest. And they also control pests by using selective brands of pesticides that do the least damage to the natural enemies of the pest and are not long-term persistent chemicals in the environment. Finally, if there's significant crop damage that does occur and the natural controls are not working, then they step in and they do insurance spraying, which is the use of a pesticide to prevent losses if it's needed. If there's no significant crop damage and the natural controls are working, then they leave the situation alone. And they know this, that the chemicals can cause resurgences and are not cost effective, so they don't do any spraying. So overall, the ultimate goal of IPM is to minimize the use of synthetic organic pesticides. Now, we do have organic farming that occurs here in the United States as well as globally. Many farmers are turning away from the use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers as well as antibiotics and hormones. They're turning away from this in their farming for grains, vegetables, and also the raising of livestock. Organic farms tend to be small, using traditional farming methods with diverse crops, and the organic crops tend to have lower yields, but they also have lower expenses, and the soil is richer, and the product is increasing in demand. Sale of organics have increased 20% per year in the last decade. Sales in the U.S. equal about $14 billion per year, and sales worldwide equal about $40 billion per year. So the sales are increasing, and the major reason for this is that there's concern over health and safety of eating foods that might have pesticide residue or antibiotics in them. So people are choosing organic because of health and safety concerns, as well as the food tastes better. Now, people are making this choice despite the fact that organic foods cost more, but the important point is that they're less likely to include any kind of pesticide residues. If there is any pesticide residue, it's probably because it comes from older, persistent pesticides that might be present in the soil that's being farmed. Now, in order to qualify as USDA organic, and by the way, USDA is United States Department of Agriculture, the farmers must be inspected and prove that at least 95% of the food is farmed in an organic fashion. They can use the seal if the food is at least 95% organic, but they cannot put a label on the product claiming that it's 100% organic. So in order to qualify for USDA organic under the Organic Food Protection Act of 1990, the food cannot contain any genetically engineered or irradiated food. No fertilizer with sludge or chemicals can be applied to the farm field, and no conventional pesticides, antibiotics, or growth hormones could be used. So to summarize this, there are many alternatives to pest control as described in an earlier slide: ecological control and integrated pest management, as well as focusing on organic farming techniques that purposefully do not employ the use of genetically engineered foods or conventional pesticides, antibiotics, and growth hormones. So we know that we have alternative methods to employ in the agricultural industry that can reduce the use of pesticides, but yet we're still using pesticides globally as well as here in the U.S. There are problems associated with pesticides from a health standpoint. They can cause acute short-term and chronic long-term health effects. It's been documented that acute effects from pesticides have affected over 93,000 people in the United States just in 1 year in 2007. Most of the people impacted in this data set were farm workers and employees of pesticide companies. Pesticides can cause nausea, abdominal pain, shock, respiratory failure, allergic reactions, seizures, pneumonia, and even coma. Over 20 pesticides may cause cancer, as well as the effects that were just listed. They can also cause birth defects, infertility, and disrupt the immune and endocrine systems. Parkinson's disease has been affiliated with pesticides exposures as well as low white blood cell counts. Some pesticides can interfere with reproductive hormones and can increase the chances of breast cancer, as well as cause abnormal sexual development. Some very low levels of chemical pesticides mimic or disrupt estrogen hormones, and it's been documented that it can impact the hormonal cycle for people. In 1999, the Endocrine Disruptor Screening Program was established to screen pesticides, chemicals, and environmental contaminants for their potential impact on estrogen and thyroid hormone problems. It's going to take decades to test all the pesticides that are currently used in the United States. As of 2016, the EPA has done a partial screening for about 1,800 chemicals that have been evaluated using high throughput assays and a computational model to model the estrogen receptor pathway. In the future, the EPA anticipates additional alternative methods will be available to do this screening based on further technology advancements, but right now the current techniques only allow for certain chemicals to be evaluated. The new methods will hopefully allow EPA to screen more chemicals in less time and involve fewer lab tests on animals, as well as cost less for the tests. Globally, an estimated 39 people per year suffer acute poisoning from pesticide exposure. Most of these cases are occurring in developing countries where untrained users have little information about pesticides and their harmful health effects, and children and families get sprayed or drink water from contaminated containers. You can tell between these two pictures, this is in a developing country, and this farmhand is not using the appropriate protective equipment to protect himself from health exposure from spraying this pesticide. This is in also a developing country, but this farmhand is utilizing the appropriate protective equipment to assure that he won't get sick from any exposure of the pesticide. So, to study the health effects of different chemical dosages, toxicologists will conduct laboratory tests on lab animals, and they will vary the amount of chemical substance concentration that they test on a lab animal in order to determine the response at each level. The results of these experiments are plotted on a graph paper to create a dose-response curve. One of the items that these toxicologists develop is something called a lethal dose, LD50. It's the dose that kills half of the test animals within a 14-day period. By comparing LD50 values between different chemicals, scientists can then judge the relative toxicity of two chemicals. So, the LD50 value is listed for chemicals in the top right corner here. The LD50 is the amount of chemical that kills 1/2 of the test animals within a given time frame, usually 2 weeks. So it's a dose concentration that results in 50% death of the test animals that were injected with it. The lower the LD50 value, the more toxic the chemical. So looking at this list, sodium chloride is salt. It takes about 3,000 parts per million, or milligrams per kilogram, as a dose in order to kill 50% of the test animals. Ferrous sulfate is also a type of salt. That's at 1,500 milligrams per kilogram, or parts per million. Interesting enough, caffeine is at 192 parts per million. So if you ever want to do a correlation, take a look at some of these 5-hour energy drinks and the various caffeine boost drinks that we have on the market that people can drink, and look at what the dose is in parts per million that you're actually consuming, and compare it to this value of the LD50 of 192 parts per million. Look at the level for DDT. DDT is a pesticide that has been banned in the United States because of its impact on the ecosystem and potential risk to human health. The LD50 value of that is 100. Doesn't it seem that the LD50 value for caffeine is just slightly higher at 192 parts per million? So there's some slight difference between the LD50 value for caffeine and DDT is more toxic, but it's interesting to me that caffeine is within 10% of the LD50 value for DDT. Look at nicotine. Nicotine in its pure form can be very toxic at 1 part per million. In fact, if you get nicotine on your skin in its purest form, in just a drop, it could kill you. Now, understand that nicotine is in cigarettes, but it's not in its purest form. It's been modified. However, still, the potential health effects from smoking cigarettes with nicotine in them have been documented as causing increased risk of cancer. So these are LD50 values, and the one that is considered to be most toxic is here at the bottom. Looking at the chart at the bottom, caffeine is in the same category as DDT and carbon tetrachloride, and it's considered to be moderately toxic. Morphine and codeine is considered to be very toxic. Heroin, parathion, a pesticide, and nicotine are considered to be extremely toxic.